All right, so now I have two mics, but I probably need to hold this one, so because I'm prone to wander away from the lectern. So the presentation I want to talk to you all about today is concerning. There's a lot of uncertainty going on in the EV transition. Obviously, a lot of it coming from legislation and the federal government. I'm going to move on to my intro slide here. So I've worked my job right now. I'm a consultant that works at RTA, which is the Fleet Success Company. We're a fleet management software firm. But I want to talk about my background. Most recently, I was the national fleet manager for the USDA Forest Service. So I kind of have a little bit of an inside perspective of some of the uncertainty that's going on coming from the federal government from the perspective of somebody being in the federal government. But I also want to talk about or share with you some of the lessons I've learned along the way as a consultant working for 6 years prior and also working in local government and state government university fleets before that. The company that I work for is primarily a fleet management software company, and we have a very big emphasis on fleet success. So we focus on the areas where fleets struggle to implement best practices, and we do that both through our software and software support, but also from the perspective of our consulting practice. Um, just a little bit of history. We've been around for a long time. This acronym on the screen, BHAG, that's our big, hairy, audacious goal, is we want to save fleets $1 billion through the use of implementing best practices. And that's a metric that we track for ourselves internally and that's our big goal. That's displayed on the wall in our headquarters. That's what we're all about. We serve about 1,200 different clients that have our fleet management software running, both local and state government, as well as private sector entities like companies that have truck fleets or van fleets or things of that nature. And we're headquartered in Glendale, Arizona. So I'll move on. I don't want to make this a total sales pitch, but we have fleet management information system software. It's a web-based product. It's pretty good. You all probably are familiar with a couple of different fleet softwares that different municipalities use and government organizations use, where we consider ourselves to be one of the top tier software in that space. And additionally, we help with consulting projects where we go into different organizations and help them implement best practices and modernize their fleets. So the big picture that I think there was some reference to in the main session was a lot of the uncertainty around the EV transition that's been going on for the last 15 or 20 years and where things are going in the future. The analogy that I like to use um, when I'm talking about EV implementation is a pendulum, right? So it swings back and forth, and the back and forth at the bottom represents short-term policy changes that happen. And I'll talk about some of those specifically within the federal government, but they kind of are expanding out into what's happening with clean cities and in the wider arena. But what I see is that the automotive industry, is generally investing towards a more electrified future. They're making investments in factories and technology that are designed to be sold across a global scale and not necessarily tied to the policies of a specific state or even a specific country. So while the pendulum can swing back and forth wildly at the bottom, where it's anchored to at the top is on a track and it's moving forward towards a more electrified and alternative fuel future. So based on the uncertainty, though, what I want to talk about is not actually all of the technical details of electrical vehicles. I think most of the folks in this room obviously can find their way to the Alternative Fuel Data Center website or other Clean Cities resources and research those things. What I really want to talk about is all of the enabling steps that a fleet management organization should be taking along the way towards building the capacity to implement electric vehicles in the future. So this is really, if you picture a pyramid, the choice at the top is electrify or not electrify, but there's all these fundamentals, fleet management fundamentals, that form the foundation of the pyramid that fleet organizations need to be able to implement so that they can be successful in implementing electric vehicles when the conditions are favorable to do so. Uh, to that end, the top tier fleet management organizations are those that can implement a class coding structure that supports analyzing their fleet properly so that they can put vehicles in the right buckets and keep track of those vehicles and their financial and characteristics. Also, uh, those organizations can utilize technology to automate and maximize data collection. They can control fleet size and composition. They can apply the principles of life cycle costing and then proactively plan for fleet replacement. So we just saw two elected representatives speak during that main session, and they talked about specifically Senator Cortez Masto was talking about the plans that had been put in place during the prior administration, um, not just within the administration but across the put in place from a legislative standpoint, implemented by Congress. What, as a fleet manager in the USDA Forest Service, I was facing was a back and forth over executive orders that that got punted around like a political football every 4 years that basically changed directionally where we were headed as a fleet management organization. So that's challenging from the standpoint that all of these initiatives are long time horizon initiatives. So just for perspective, the fleet that I was managing, 18,000 vehicles on road, 5,000 vehicles off road. Those include bulldozers, construction equipment, trailers, the types of equipment that you see on the news when the wildfires are raging. Anything from green fire trucks to bulldozers making fire line. So trying to move a fleet of that size is like trying to, steer a battleship. It takes a long time to start implementing practices at the national level so that they can start flowing down to actual boots on the ground implementation. Some of the history of the executive orders that we've been operating under as a federal government, in 2015. So you can mentally anchor the year to the administration. So this was the Obama administration, more towards the end. The goals were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we were measuring that in grams of CO2 equivalent per mile by certain percentages based off of whatever the fleet's performance was during a 2014 baseline. So however your fleet was performing, there were percentage reduction targets over time. An additional goal was to buy 20% of our light-duty vehicle replacements as zero emissions by the year 2020 and 50% by 2025. So 2018, now we're 1 year, 2 years into the Trump administration. That executive order canceled, reversed. Essentially, the guidance coming out was be more efficient. Not really anything tied to specific sustainability initiatives. 2021, now we're into the Biden administration. That was reversed, and we're back to now buying 100% zero emissions for light duty vehicles by 2027 and for medium and heavy duty trucks by 2035. And then, some of these were long range goals under the assumption that the marketplace was going to be able to implement changes in technology that would then make those goals achievable over time. So there was kind of a little bit of a waiting game to see the technology catch up with the goals. Another goal that we had in place was to put telematics in vehicles to assist in planning for the transition. Personally, from my perspective, when that executive order came down, my focus was to actually focus all of our effort on the telematics part, because I was going to focus on, and I see the guy from Geotab nodding his head yes. He's like, yep. So we actually implemented Geotab at the Forest Service, and we rolled out over 17,000 device installations in about an 8-month time period. So you can probably imagine that soaks up all of our bandwidth for focusing on extra special projects and kind of forced us to push electrification off to the side for a time period with the understanding that once we did electrify, we could then right size our fleet. We could understand where vehicles were being parked, how they were being used, and then use that as a springboard to move into a more aggressive electrification approach. And now we're in 2025. Those executive orders have been, that particular executive order from 2021 has been canceled, and there wasn't any superseding guidance. It's just radio silent as far as what the strategy is for federal fleets. Now that has created a lot of ongoing uncertainty. That type of uncertainty is also now mapping over into the clean cities arena. There's some uncertainty about funding and things of that nature. So there's a lot of regulatory ambiguity. There's some risk of EV investment or infrastructure, the return on investment that people would anticipate based on a more aggressive rollout of electric vehicles. If there's less throughput going through that infrastructure investment, then it could reduce its attractiveness. Different patchwork of rules for different states, procurement challenges, especially when you're awarding contracts, multi-year contracts to buy vehicles. So just a lot of instability. And again, the reason I say this is that I want to emphasize that during this time period of uncertainty, there are a lot of things that you can do to promote long-term EV adoption. And I'm talking about 5, 10, 15 years. But what that looks like now is your organization and building capacity so that you can do those things when the playing field is a lot more clear in terms of your direction. So last year, RTA was here to present. My colleague Mark Canton, he talked about some of the higher level analyses that you would actually do to while you're in the process of doing an EV implementation. Those included goal setting and calculating greenhouse gas emissions, requirements analysis for electric vehicle supply equipment, the effects of EVs on your maintenance and repair programs as a fleet organization, and evaluating the bottom line costs and benefits of EV adoption. How much greenhouse gas can you avoid per dollar spent? Things of that nature. What I'm going to focus on are the fundamentals that indirectly support EV adoption, because I think that's valuable for a fleet audience, and definitely something relevant for this period of uncertainty. And again, the benefit of having me present is that I'm kind of in two worlds right now, that I just came from working in the federal government on this type of stuff, but I'm also working, as a consultant that works with a lot of different organizations to implement these best practices. Just a simple, basic thing that's often overlooked in EV implementation is that a lot of organizations have traditionally only developed their class code structure of their vehicles around the assumption that everything is a conventionally fueled vehicle. And what we actually find is that, a class code structure needs to properly define a vehicle based on its characteristics, its vocation, and that the vehicles are financially similar. So what do I mean by that? You could have a Chevrolet Tahoe, for example, vehicles that come off the assembly line one after the other. One could be placed into an application where it's a fire battalion chief vehicle. And the next one off the assembly line could potentially be a law enforcement canine vehicle or some other general vehicle in the fleet. And if you're just relying upon the fact that this is a large, half-ton SUV, then you're missing a big part of the picture that drives when you should replace that vehicle, when it wears out, when you can anticipate needing funding to replace it, the maintenance requirements for that vehicle, how much wear and tear it's going to get, how severe of a duty cycle it's going to be, and things of that nature. Couple that with, now you have layer that complexity with, okay, now this vehicle might actually be an electric vehicle, or it might be a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, or it could be, any range of the alternative fuel possibilities that are out there. And that essentially requires that you, as a foundational step in implementing EVs, is that you look at your class code structure to make sure that you can, when you describe a vehicle in your fleet management information system, in whatever database you're using, that it's clear to whoever's looking at it that they know what you're talking about. Um, so I can jump through this. This won't take too long, but um, really, vehicle classification is used to group vehicles by weight range, body configuration, drive type, fuel type, and then vocation or specification. And in my opinion, a good classification system is one that has what I call character level significance. So I'll show you what I mean by that. Now, I kind of skipped over the first bullet. Fleets can be made up of dozens, if not hundreds, of vehicle types. We actually had, I think, 606 different vehicle classes in the Forest Service. And those were, if you actually broke everything down by that level of specificity. Now, obviously, those vehicles got grouped into much larger groupings for analytical purposes, but um, that's how much granularity there can be in a mixed fleet of a large size. Probably most municipalities and smaller fleets are going to have far fewer class codes than that. But that was just a starting point for us. Hopefully, this is not too much of an eye chart, but uh, the first character in a class code should be looking at the weight range. Um, Typically, class codes, if you actually run a VIN decode through the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration website, they have some pretty good resources there. You can input any VIN number for a vehicle, and it will spit out a level of detail on that vehicle and how it's configured that's supplied by the manufacturer, so that you can access that data from their database. And vehicles are either categorized as a weight range, and then when you get into a mixed fleet with off-road assets, then you also have to consider your non-self-propelled vehicles like trailers and your off-road and construction equipment. But generally speaking, you're going to follow along weight ranges that are defined by I think this was originally an American Trucking Association standard, these weight ranges, but NHTSA has adopted them. You can move on to what type of body the vehicle has. So whether it's an automobile, passenger van, cargo van, sport utility, regular cab, super cab, or crew cab truck, those are different body codes that you'll see in a fleet. Different drive types, whether it's four-wheel drive, two-wheel drive. Some vehicles in your fleet are not going to have any drive type. They're going to be trailers. So there's a lot of different things. You might have tracked equipment in your fleet as well. That's obviously, I mentioned we had bulldozers in the Forest Service. A lot of municipalities are going to run bulldozers for landfill applications, and they may have some type of excavator equipment that's tracked. That's important to understand. And then we get to the important part of this, which is having a fuel code that represents the different fuel types for vehicles. So these are the things that you would want to apply: a plug-in hybrid, gasoline, regular hybrid, flex fuel, things of that nature. And just as an example of some of the vocation codings that we used in the Forest Service, um, we had what's shown at the top: Type 6 platform, Type 7 prevention. These are different types of fire trucks, wildland fire apparatus, and they represent pump capacity and tank capacity. We had all different types of general use vehicles, standard body, utility body. We had some unique applications in our class code structure, like hotshot support vehicles. Those are the fire crews that actually go up on the mountain and lay down fire line. And then you've got various law enforcement types and things of that nature.
Well, what you establish your class codes back in 2005 based on that.
So that's a good question. And I mentioned NAFA actually in this slide. Um, so let me circle back to that when I get down to that bullet. Um, so here's an example of a law enforcement rock crawler. We have Jeeps in the Forest Service to go, drive down the Rubicon Trail and things like that. Um, and they have their own characteristics, but nowadays you could actually buy a Jeep Wrangler that is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So you have to account for that. This is just a quick example. Uh, Again, each character would have an underlying meaning. Um, Most of the characters in this class code can be derived from that VIN decode data that provides clear definition around what that vehicle is. And a good resource that you mentioned was NAFA, which was formerly referred to as the National Association of Fleet Administrators. They now just have rebranded themselves as NAFA, but that organization provides kind of a voluntary consensus standard for how you would classify your vehicles. Even their NAFA class code system, which was developed probably in somewhere between 2000 2005, and it's one that have used and implemented in different organizations. Um, Even that has some weaknesses that it doesn't actually maintain that character level significance. I think with a 4-digit class code, you may not be capturing the fuel type. The NAFA system does not capture fuel type. So it leaves you with kind of a jumbled mess of class code structure that, if you're not intentional about, is difficult to manage. Um,
Well,
this,
your size fleet,
yeah, yeah,
5,000 or however many units you got. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
right,
And
yeah,
complex versus it was a little bit easier in a standardized county fleet.
right.
There's an after class code.
Yeah, so we had 18,000 on road. We had about 3,500 just in California. Um, and I mean, so we had 6,000 half-ton trucks, just half-ton trucks. You know, various other types, a lot of 3/4 tons, etc. So yeah, it can get kind of unwieldy and unmanageable. And actually, what we would see somewhat in our organization, the reason I emphasize using using VIN decode is that there are once the organization gets so large, it becomes kind of unmanageable because you have 175 fleet managers across the country, and you're relying upon them to actually put vehicles in the right classes when those vehicles are received into the fleet. So it's a lot easier to provide a tool to say, okay, input the VIN number, and we'll give you a recommended class code for that vehicle so that you can get it slotted into the right class code, because that for us would affect our billing and how much we were charging our customer programs in terms of a monthly charge and a cost per mile. So it was important to get that information right, basically from the get go when the vehicle's introduced into the fleet. Obviously, you can't VIN decode every aspect of it. If you don't know from a VIN number if it's a law enforcement vehicle, a fire vehicle, or a general use vehicle, you have to merge the two pieces of data together to get the right class code there. Um, Looking for outlier vehicles in the fleet is important too. So we had maybe 3,500 vehicles in one class. And then when you decode the data down, you see that there's a handful of vehicles of a certain class code. And I would always have to question, well, why did we select that oddball vehicle for that application? Is that vehicle selection being made as a function of the preferences of the individuals of that local unit? Or is this something where we should be more focused on standardizing and trying to eliminate all those outliers in the fleet through our replacement program so that it becomes much more manageable to implement an EV strategy when things are kind of controlled and we're funneling people into a more narrow selection set of vehicles. But to answer your question, I would say what I would recommend is using something that is based on the NAFA class code system, but you would have to probably modify it to some degree to fit your local considerations to make sure that you were covering the vehicle types that were actually represented in your fleet, um, so that you could, properly bill for your vehicles. You could properly report out how many vehicles of each type are in what classes. So no, there's not. I think that standard needs to be updated personally. So
Minimizes 1 year's pro.
yeah, 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 and I
Quantify to adjust the fuel differences, and
mhm.
there's the implementation certainly one of those in the rules that
Right. Yeah. So for the folks online, the I guess the response was to to add those modifications into your system and to make sure that that you have those to accommodate your EV implementation. Okay, moving on to the second big part of what I was focused on at the Forest Service that I mentioned was this uh, automating and maximizing data collection through technology. And specifically, it was about uh, a 2 year or maybe 18-month project to get just to the point of getting our first devices shipped. And that's not a reflection on Geotab as a supplier. I'm saying that those were internal battles that we had to fight, um, with, and I shouldn't say fight. I mean, we had good partnership along the way, but it's just educating folks in leadership, speaking to our union representatives that represent the workforce about how to address their concerns. How is the data going to be used? Is it going to be used for disciplinary purposes and things of that nature? When we were really focused on implementing telematics as a strategy to help us with asset management. So our primary asset management objectives for telematics was to support our fleet allocation decisions, which is to identify and reallocate underutilized vehicles, um, eliminate vehicles from the fleet that are no longer needed, reduce downtime. We had a big problem just because of geographic um, considerations, how spread out everything is. Vehicles would get dropped off at a shop, and the fleet manager had no idea that it was dropped off there, and wouldn't even know to follow up with that dealership to find out when that vehicle is going to be ready to be um, ready for service. So we had huge downtime problems where vehicles would sit in dealership lots, and we were failing to check up on them to make sure that they were getting properly repaired. And then another big part that we were looking at was improving fleet credit card fraud detection. That was a huge part of our program. Um, Not only was I managing, 23,000 assets, I was managing 23,000 credit cards being used by 35,000 people to run about 775,000 credit card transactions a year and spends roughly $100 million in spend. So it was important for us to have telematics on our vehicles so that we could actually see where we could get a question about a particular transaction, and we can say, well, was that vehicle actually at that location at that time? Yes or no, in some cases. So that's a side benefit of telematics. But again, these are all things that an organization needs to do to build capacity so that they can do a successful implementation later. Now, something that specifically uh, supports an electrification process is identifying just where are my vehicles? Um, where are they being parked overnight? Are they actually at the public works yard where I think they are, or are they being parked at a different government location, or are they being parked at somebody's house? And then the question is that person authorized to take that vehicle home? So going back to the idea of uh, the the best um, the best fuel to avoid carbon emissions is not driving the vehicle. You can cut down on vehicle miles traveled significantly when you go to having those controls in place for how your vehicles are being used, where they're being parked, etc. So this is just a display of all the vehicles we had just in California as we were rolling them out, and the map looks like this, but across the country for obviously for a 17,000 vehicle deployment. Well, let me go back to that one. The important part for that ties directly to electrification is obviously you want to know exactly where a vehicle is being parked overnight because you're going to have to tie the infrastructure that supports that vehicle to that vehicle's parking location and know that information. So we used a lot of the tools within the telematics platform to start drawing zones around each facility and then tagging the zones to identify whether that facility had a bulk fuel site, what type of facility it was, whether that vehicle or that facility had EV infrastructure already in place. So we were tagging specific locations as level 1, level 2 type of facilities. So that was helping us build the data foundation so that we understood where our vehicles are and where our biggest opportunities were going to be to implement EV charging. Another area that uh, or another benefit that was directly supported by having a telematics implementation in our fleet was to start developing metrics around the how the vehicles are being used. And the metric, and I'm not trying to plug Geotab, but I'm sure he's grateful for all the references here. But the metric that they used specifically in their system was to run an analysis and run an analysis on your conventionally fueled vehicles, um, and you could figure out how many days per month would did that vehicle operate in such a manner that there would be an operational constraint if you went to an electric vehicle, a range constraint. So what I mean by that is how many days per month would you have to charge in the middle of the day in order to accomplish your assigned duties? And you could apply a sliding scale to that. How much of a, pain in the backside factor is it going to be to put an electric vehicle in this particular vocation or application? So is your organization willing to accept that 1 day a month you're going to have to find a DC fast charger in the middle of the day, 2 days a month, five, or zero? It depends on your organization. It depends on, uh, a variety of factors, what the vocation for the vehicle is, etc. Um, Additionally, there were some tools built within that platform to look at how much of a life cycle cost, benefit, or penalty an electric vehicle would be. So, is it going to cost more, $1,000 more, $2,000 more over the life cycle for this asset to be electric, or could it potentially be a situation where it costs less? So, those were just some of the tools that we started looking at. But again, implementing telematics across the fleet was foundational for us to have that data set from which to do all of those higher level analyses. A big part of a successful fleet, and then EV fleet, would be having a fleet where you can control fleet size and composition, making sure that you don't have underutilized vehicles sitting around that are costing the organization money without actually providing a benefit to the organization in terms of delivering its services or its mission. So, why would you do this? Most fleets suffer from this term we call fleet creep, where everybody, you start to see vehicles in the fleet they're getting upgraded. They're larger and larger capacity when it's not really necessary in order to do the job. Um, Areas where you'd see a 3/4 ton truck performing a job that could be done by, a Ford Maverick or something like that. That's a hybrid electric vehicle that gets 40 plus miles to the gallon. You can reduce fleet size. That was a big one for us. We implemented our telematics in between the 2023 and 2024 field seasons. We called it field season in the summer when everybody was going out to do all the recreation support and firefighting and trail maintenance and things like that. So our goal was to implement telematics over the winter so that we could then get a full field season's worth of data collection and then regroup the following fall and figure out what is our new fleet strategy based on all of this new information that we have. And what we found was, um, we were getting complaints from a lot of programs that they had that fleet budget was crowding out all of their other work. And they also had a lot of vehicles that weren't getting a lot of miles. So the simple solution is we need to figure out where to cut vehicles out of the fleet. Um, so while I was there, we actually managed to reduce from about 18,500 vehicles down to 17,000. So implementing telematics allowed us to cut 1,500 vehicles out of the fleet, which is, 1,500 vehicles is probably, that reduction is bigger than a lot of the fleets, at a municipal level. So that's a huge. Imagine being able to zero out, $10 million worth of annual spend or $15 million worth of annual spend just by right sizing. And then you can use that 10 or $15 million to support your electric vehicle implementation, and you have better data to do it with. Right sizing also reduces the need for electric vehicle supply equipment. It reduces the need for maintenance or repair, reduces the workload for the maintenance or repair section of the organization, reduces your capital costs, how much you're spending uh, on an annual basis to renew the fleet, and also gives you a financial windfall if you are able to take the proceeds from those sales and plow them back into your fleet replacement fund. Um, Again, if you right type, there's going to be more opportunities potentially to find those EV alternatives, getting rid of those medium duty trucks and going downsize to, say, Ford F-150 Lightning or a Chevy Silverado EV, or even, a smaller type of application like I was mentioning with the Ford Maverick hybrid or any of the other truck options out there. Um, so I'm going to talk about some of the different right sizing and right typing approaches that a fleet organization would potentially need to implement, which would center around what the industry calls a vehicle allocation methodology, which is a survey-based approach, a combination of survey data as well as fleet management information system data to understand your vehicles and those opportunities for right sizing. Zero-based asset requirement definition, that's really just starting with a clean sheet of paper and trying to identify. That's a very labor-intensive approach. Another strategy to right size or right type is to implement a motor pool or start. So that could be done in a couple of ways. There's a lot of different hardware and software platforms, key control systems, all of those types of things out there that would help an organization successfully implement a motor pool. One of the benefits that a motor pool could provide is that, I mentioned the number of days of midday charging. That was one of the metrics we were looking at. If you have somebody who has a vehicle assigned and, say, 18 work days out of 20, they can do their job with an electric vehicle, then you have to think about what type of motor pool do I need to support them on the 2 days where they're going to exceed their range. So maybe those are days where they take a different vehicle. If they know in advance what their job assignment's going to look for that day and how many miles they're going to drive, they could say, okay, well, I'm going to go to the motor pool and I'm going to grab an electric vehicle for this day, but on the other days, I'm going to, grab a plug-in hybrid or something else. I want to talk about the VAM process in a little bit more detail. Usually this is a study that is done either internally within the organization if you have, data analysts that can perform this type of work, or it can be outsourced. It starts with looking at the entire fleet inventory of the organization, developing utilization criteria. So the thing that you're trying to accomplish in running a survey to find out from your users how they're using their vehicles would be to have them answer questions about um, what are the types of things that they're doing with their vehicles, what are the jobs that they're performing, what are the characteristics of their job that drive the characteristics of the vehicle. So why do they need a work truck? Why do they need a van? Why do they need some larger type of vehicle? The approach is then to distribute the survey, gather information, and then use that to do a lot of data analysis to figure out what vehicle types support particular applications. The approach that's typically used is to conduct that data call and essentially translate the survey responses into some type of point system. So you're not going to be able to, I guess what I'm trying to say is in a fleet organization where you're gathering mileage information from your fuel management system, which is typical for fleets. If you have an internal fuel site, you're going to be getting fuel data coming into your fleet management information system. What you're not going to know, you're only getting a touch point of every fill up of how many miles that vehicle drove since the last time it was fueled. You're going to get better data if you're using a telematics system. But if you don't have telematics implemented yet, the middle approach could be to use a survey to ask people, how many miles per day are you typically driving? How many days per week are you typically driving? Are you driving all day or you? So I think you get the idea. That approach can be translated into assigning point values to vehicles so that you're looking not only as utilization as the number of miles that a vehicle drove, but you're also trying to figure out what are the non-mileage utilization factors for this vehicle, and figure out from that standpoint what are the low use, low mile vehicles, and those are the ones that you want to target for elimination in your fleet. So, if representing that more graphically, this is an actual example of data that we developed in the Forest Service. We implemented a survey. Um, we got about we got more than a 99% response rate. So we got about 15,000 responses for the roughly 15,000 vehicles that we were surveying, to try to figure out how people were using their vehicles, what were the job types of the people, and mapping them specifically to vehicle types. Um, we did not survey our fire apparatus because those are pretty clear. It's pretty cut and dried what a fire truck is used for. I don't need to ask every firefighter what a fire truck is used for. It's pretty simple. Same thing with law enforcement. There are some vocations in your fleet that are just, they make sense and you don't need to actually gather information. But for all the different job types, the hydrologist, the, soil scientist, the plant biologists, all the people that go, study bats in the night, and all these other weird jobs that people had in the Forest Service, we needed to understand, you know, what it was about their job that required that they had a particular vehicle type. So, anyways, um, the point of this slide is just to show that you can have a bunch of vehicles. You have a cluster of vehicles kind of in the center of the chart that represent the typical vehicle of that class. And then you have a bunch of data points that are high and to the right, and those are usually the high utilization vehicles and high mission need vehicles. And then you have a bunch of vehicles that are low and to the left, and those are the ones where that vehicle's sitting around on the back lot, nobody's really using it, and nobody would really miss it if it was gone. Those are the opportunities that you can use to save on your fleet size, and that represents the opportunity to plow that money back into your electrification program later on. These are just some quick results, not really too important here, but um, the on the table, what we identified in red were 1,111 vehicles that we could eliminate from the fleet pretty easily. And then additionally, we had another 508 low utilization, low mission need vehicles. And that's how we were able to accomplish a 1,500 vehicle reduction in the fleet and actually get those vehicles, commitment from leadership to get those vehicles off the books and out to the auction house. Yes, sir.
How are you defining high normal low utilization?
Oh, so that's a good question. And that could be that. So there's a mathematical approach. And what I was doing was screening for outliers in the data. So when you look at this graph here, you kind of have it broken up into 9 areas of the graph. It's kind of like a pound sign, or I don't know, people call it a hashtag now. But they represent low, medium, high on 2 axes, right? This is the way that I defined it, was by looking at this is kind of like, if you're averse or allergic to statistics, then just tune out for a minute. But screening for outliers, looking at medians, looking at first quartile and third quartile of the data, and then calculating what is a normal range, or the approach for screening for outliers is to actually use that type of approach. So the better way to describe it without like math nerding it is to talk about the oh, now I'm blanking that I'm not talking about it like a mathematical nerd problem. So basically, it's a relative versus an absolute. It's a similar concept to a standard deviation, but what I was doing was looking at it from, you have you could take any set of data, like how old are people in this room, and you could divide it into quartiles. 25% of the room is under this age, 25% is between this age and this age, then 25% is above that, and 25%. So that first quartile and third quartile represents the middle 50. So 50% of the room are between this age and this age. And really, that's kind of what you're almost looking at in a way on this graph. Now, there's a little bit more behind it, so it's not exactly, so don't start counting dots and calling me out. Um, you can apply a range to that to determine how sensitive that middle 50 is. So obviously, you don't want to just take the middle 50 and eliminate 25% of your fleet on the low end. The typical way it's done is figuring out where is the middle 50, how wide is the middle 50, and then multiplying a coefficient times that, you figure how far to the left of that that 25% mark, how far to the left of that do you want to go to actually screen for the outliers and say this is a vehicle that statistically is outside of the norm for this population of vehicles. So it's basically saying, like, if there was a toddler that walked into the room, we could be like, that kid is not like everybody else, right? That there's a mathematical approach to figure out what age that is, whether it's 13, 15, 18, 25, that you would say somebody's way younger than everybody in the room. The same thing with this type of approach in identifying that screening for outliers approach. So if you were interested, homework assignment, go and look at screening for outliers. You could just Google search it. You'll find a Wikipedia article that has, kind of basic approaches that you can use to do that. Um, Now, in a more like general description of how this is done, or how I view it, a lot of fleets will define their utilization criteria as basically saying, if a vehicle is under 5,000 miles per year, then it's underutilized. And what that creates are a lot of false positives. Okay, well, I have a plumbing van or some type of
Silly.
facility tech where they're using the vehicle 8 hours a day. They drive to the site, they work on the facility, they fix the plumbing, whatever, and they're using their van all day as a mobile workshop and part storage. They've gone to the van 20 times during the course of the day. It's fully utilized, but they only drove 3 miles in the morning and 3 miles back to the yard in the evening. That, if you're just using that type of simple absolute standard, would dictate that vehicle's underutilized. 3 miles a day or 6 miles a day times, 200 some odd work days a year, you're not even cracking 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles.
Based on your survey, you can determine how that vehicle's used.
Right. So when you do this study, you're going to categorize it by use, by application,
Right.
so that your underutilized vehicles that are in common class of being driven every day, that's where you determine your utilization
within that group of vehicles. So you can't use conglomerate
Correct.
1,000 vehicles and determine
Right.
5,000 miles.
Exactly. So this is the difference between having a relative standard and an absolute standard. The absolute standard is just saying 5,000 miles, cut it off. Too many false positives to be useful, especially on those low mileage applications, low mileage classes. When you look at the numbers like this, you're developing it's a relative standard. I want to find the plumbing van that is low utilization relative to all the other ones. The one that's the spare van, or, that's just sitting around in the back lot that nobody's using. And,
just in case.
yeah, exactly. So that's, that approach, the absolute standard approach would just saying 5,000, cut it off. The relative approach is come up with that middle 50, apply the simple math to get you to a proper outlier threshold, and then cut it off and say, this is a low utilization vehicle relative to everything else. And that's why it's important.
What is your point value you're going to assign?
Correct.
You have a ranking model
for replacement, but it's the maintenance, usage, age, point, right?
Okay.
Create some
Right.
Real idea of replacement scoring for the fleet.
Exactly.
Simply take, instead of usage, or you use utilization, but application now, you cut door point versus some other criteria.
Right. Yeah, and I've got a slide on that as well. That's another good approach that we implemented. Okay, so some of these vehicles that are eliminate listed on here was that based on the survey responses, somebody said, I can get rid of this vehicle. They explicitly said that. We're not going to miss it if it goes away. the ones where it says low utilization, low emission need, those are the ones where we surveyed them, and based on their responses to the survey, we developed a score for the vehicle that put it in the low left part of the hashtag, pound sign, whatever. And then everything else is kind of ranked in between there. The orange ones were ranked as low and one or the other of category. One of the things we didn't want to do was we didn't want to cut too hard too fast, because taking 10% of your fleet out, like 1,500 out of 18,000 or 8% of your fleet, that's a pretty good chunk. And a lot of that utilization is actually going to shift from the vehicles that were eliminated. Even though they were underutilized, they were still being driven 2,000 miles a year. That utilization is now going to shift onto the other vehicles that are co-located with it, or else that job's just not going to get done. So, I mean, so that mileage has to go somewhere. Um, so we wanted to, by cutting vehicles, some vehicles would actually start to tip into the moderately utilized category if all of the other vehicles were eliminated from the fleet. So this actually transitions into, what do you do with this data? Well, in one way, you can come up with a summary of the entire fleet and look at how many vehicles of what type should the fleet need, and also look at this by fuel types and configurations. And the reason to develop something like this is to kind of, if you're in a smaller fleet, it's hold yourself accountable. But if you're in a larger fleet, it's to hold all of those small sub fleets accountable and say, you're only authorized to have this number of vehicles of these types, and we're going to monitor that over time and make sure that those smaller fleets are falling in line um, with the results of their VAM process. So this is actually just numbers that I came up with when working with another federal agency before I joined the Forest Service. So this was about a 8,100 vehicle fleet, and it's just an example of how you can develop a matrix that shows what is the proper size and composition for that particular fleet. Then you can break this apart at smaller unit levels. Oh, you know what? This must be one of Mark's slides because it has animations to it. Oh, he's messing me up here. Okay. So how do you transition from a fleet right sizing project like a VAM study to a fleet right sizing program? Is using that optimal fleet profile, like I just showed on the previous slide, to monitor each organizational unit, and then benchmark all your active on-hand vehicles periodically to make sure that you're maintaining your fleet in accordance with that ceiling that you've established from a data standpoint. Additionally, you want to establish controls for your fleet. You want to have policy and procedure around um, who gets to approve requests for additional vehicles to the fleet, and who has authority to retain a vehicle once it's been replaced. That's a lot of where fleet creep comes in. Is a new truck has been bought, the old truck's still in pretty decent shape, and we got to keep it. Yeah, just in case. Break glass in case of emergency, right? So that's how your fleet size starts to grow and grow and grow. Well, I mean, yeah, that truck was paid for, so it's viewed as, this is like the sunk cost fallacy. That truck, the old one that's being replaced, was already paid for years ago. But you have to think that you're foregoing the revenue from selling the truck. So there could be $5, $6, $10,000 in residual value to remarket that vehicle that you can push back into your program. And then additionally, there's going to be some maintenance or repair and overhead cost to keep that vehicle in the fleet for an additional time period. So it needs to have a PM done on it periodically. In the once in a blue moon, somebody does go out to start it, they're going to go out there and they're going to click the ignition, and the battery's going to be dead because it hasn't been driven in 3 months. The tires are going to be low. So that kind of stuff always happens when you have too many vehicles in your fleet. So you definitely want to have the same level of scrutiny on new vehicle requests as you would apply during the VAM process. So you want to survey people during the VAM process. You want to have people answer the same types of questions during the acquisition process when they're requesting a new vehicle. Is this going to be a vehicle that's going to drive low utilization? If so, we want to know what it's being used for, what mission type, who's using it. That way you could make sure that they get the right type of vehicle, and if that vehicle were to be approved for purchase. Another approach to doing this, it kind of ties in with the optimal fleet profile, is to look at standardization and look at this from the standpoint of a ratio based on how many employees you have of each type in an organization. I'm not sure how many local or state government organizations do this to the same extent that the federal government does or the military does, but in the federal government, everybody's in an occupational class or a job series. And for the most, for in a lot of cases, you could know what somebody does as their day-to-day job just based on what numerical code is assigned to them in HR and what job they're in. Like, so for example, in the Forest Service, I was a GS 2150, which means Transportation Operations Specialist. So you could actually look that up and see what are my job duties and things like that to try to infer what I'm doing from a day-to-day basis. Some of those job types can be mapped directly over to a vehicle type that supports that job. So it's a good idea to identify what those mappings are. Like, I know for our law enforcement people, I need a particular vehicle type to support a special investigator or a canine officer or things like that. So that the fleet size should start to track in alignment with the organization size and the organizational complement. It's especially important during periods where there's maybe reductions in force or downsizing, or going the other direction if there's some significant expansion in the workforce. Oftentimes, um, the budget program may not think about the vehicle needs when they're approving positions. So it's good to have that mapping to say, well, if we're going to add, 50 officers, that means we need X number of vehicles to support those officers. I worked on a project with the Marine Corps, actually, the Installations Command. They refer to this approach as, all the military branches have some variation of this. They call it a table of allowance or a table of organization and equipment. And it's what they use to identify what is the gear that is needed for this particular person. And the same type of approach can be used from a fleet management planning standpoint. So the this Marine Corps project I worked on was kind of interesting because they wanted to know what would it look like if we established a base in Guam and it had this many people of these types. How do you translate what's the fleet size that we would need on day one if we were to create such a base? So we had to work on the project to try to figure that out. That was more of a theoretical exercise, but you can also apply that as part of your controls in your organization. When somebody comes to you with a request for new vehicles and you say, well, what's driving the change in mission that makes this new vehicle necessary? And if they can't point to any expansion of their mission, then it's a lot easier to say, well, we don't think that this request is supported. Okay. Any questions on what I've covered so far? All right. Applying principles of life cycle costing is an important part of being able to plan for electrification. An organization that struggles to understand how long you should keep vehicles of different types in terms of how many years you should keep them in service or how many miles they should accumulate before you plan for replacement. They're going to struggle. That organization is going to struggle with any type of electrification project because, doing an electrification project is life cycle costing, but you're adding in a lot of complicating factors. So your organization would need to have the capacity to do some form of life cycle cost analysis on your vehicles, to determine when they should be replaced, and help you to establish your replacement plan. So obviously, it falls to fleet managers to determine how frequently vehicles should be replaced. A lot of organizations keep vehicles way too long, and it's not necessarily a function of what they plan to do. It's where the fleet management, the life cycle analysis that the fleet managers conducted runs into the reality of the budget, and you have to start making trade-off decisions about what you're going to replace. And so we'll talk about how you can do that in kind of a more objective way rather than making it a subjective exercise. Effective fleet management includes identifying life cycles to minimize the total cost of ownership. So it's achieving the right balance between your capital and operating costs. So in order to be able to do this, your organization would need to be able to quantify the key direct and maybe even indirect costs of acquiring, using, and maintaining and repairing and disposing of vehicles over a range of life cycles. Those cost factors would include the purchase price, upfitting costs, residual value. That's, how much money you would hope to achieve when you sell the vehicle at some point in the future. Operating costs, which are maintenance or repair and fuel. So these are all direct costs that tied to a specific vehicle. They could be calculated for each, and should be calculated for each vehicle in your fleet. There are also indirect costs of the fleet. How much of your additional time is being taken up dealing with old vehicles and the maintenance or repair problems on old vehicles. And then other acquisition, disposal, registration fees, and taxes. When you're looking at life cycle costing, you don't want to include accident costs. Accident costs should be ignored in that particular process because they're not representative of the normal wear and tear on a vehicle.
Yeah, typically it'll come out of here.
Correct. Correct. They don't. Those accident costs likely will not come out of the fleet budget. They'll be subrogated against whomever is responsible for that particular accident. Let's see how we're doing on time real quick. So we've got, how long do we have?
Past 10.
Yeah. When I just wanted to check on time.
I think if we can go, let's take a break or a quick break. They're taking a break in the general session.
Okay. I just started to see people milling around in the hallway, so I just wanted to check in. Okay.
Yeah. And it finished up by about.
We want to finish up by we're trying to be in sync with those guys. So share about 11:50.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Will that be enough time for you?
Yes. Okay. So starting a 10-minute break, we'll be back at 11:12. 11:12. Okay.
To be exactly on.
Okay. All right. Where we left off, we were covering the last slide I covered was talking about the cost factors for a life cycle cost analysis. And this is what you would use to determine how long to keep your vehicles before planning for replacement. So I was about to move into, where does this cost data come from? Typically in a fleet management organization, it would come from a financial or property management system. It can come from purchase orders and contracts and schedules to give you prices for new vehicles, as well as fuel purchase prices. The information can come from fuel or fleet card systems, whether you manage and operate internal bulk fuel systems, or you're more reliant upon fleet credit cards for your fueling needs. These can also include maintenance or repair charges and fuel consumption and cost, as well as the data coming from fleet management information systems. Those are the types of specialty software that's used to aggregate all of these different data types from all these different sources into, a common picture of assets, maintenance and repair records, fuel records, motor pool management records, those types of things. Specifically, the data you would be looking for from an FMIS would be in-house maintenance or repair and labor and parts costs, as well as past information about vehicle sales and vehicle purchase costs. So there's kind of two different components to this going on at the same time. The data in the top scatter plot represents the loss in residual value of a vehicle or depreciation of an asset as a percentage of its original purchase price. So we all know that, vehicle depreciates and loses value pretty quickly in its initial years. They always say a vehicle loses value when you drive it off the lot. That's true in most cases. We've had some weird stuff with inflation recently and supply chain issues that can get that a little bit upside down. But generally speaking, vehicles always lose value as they age. More pronounced loss in value in the initial years, and then it starts to flatten out in the out years. The graph on the bottom shows the increase in maintenance or repair costs over time. So a vehicle is generally going to increase. There's going to be more part failures, more repairs that aren't covered by warranty as a vehicle ages, especially when it gets beyond 50, 100,000 miles, 150,000 miles. You're starting to look at somewhere in that 100 to 150 range. You might be looking at major component replacements like transmissions, depending on, how severe of a duty cycle that vehicle's in. Other things start to break on the vehicle. You start to have engine repairs, O2 sensors, alternators, all those different types of things that can have a wear out phase that happens to increase your annual maintenance or repair costs as the vehicle ages. When you combine those two graphs, you kind of get this this graph here that we see, where on the y-axis we have the annual cost of the vehicle, and on the x-axis we have age. So as you move out to the right, the blue is representing the capital costs or depreciation. The orange is representing the increase in maintenance or repair costs. And when you combine those two things, you get kind of the gray curve. And what you're trying to do is minimize the costs of that asset over its life cycle. So when it gets to, probably for this asset, you'd be looking in the 8 to 10 year range. You want to be thinking about replacing that asset when that curve is at a minimum value, or shortly thereafter. So those are the kinds of things that you would uncover during a life cycle cost analysis. That's what's going to be a data-driven approach to establishing your replacement cycle criteria, rather than it just being kind of a subjective assessment based on your experience as a fleet manager.
Can't you just rely on that?
You can, but
People, that's what they should be doing, because it might stay.
You can, to an extent. However, most people nowadays, or I should say, there's more of an expectation nowadays that people make decisions based off of data. That even as a consumer, you're trying to decide what restaurant to go to, and you look at Yelp or Travel or TripAdvisor or whatever other website to say, or Google reviews, and you say, well, this restaurant has X number of 5-star ratings, and it's got, and how many people provided that input. Okay. So there's an expectation that just as regular consumers that we make decisions based off of data rather than subjective criteria. And fleet managers, traditionally could get away with just being the person that's, I've been in charge of fleet for 30 years. I know my stuff from working on the shop floor, all the way from a wrench turning mechanic to the fleet superintendent to the fleet division director. But there's going to start to be pushback, or there has been pushback on that as those expectations migrate towards data-driven decision making.
Because I said so doesn't work.
Yes, because I said so. Yeah. It might work in some organizations still, and if you got that, then great, use it. But yeah, so using an analytical approach has to be part of the mix nowadays. Other considerations for life cycle cost analysis is the accuracy of your internal data. Um, Obviously, I'm part of this RTA organization. We are a fleet software company. That's it for the pitch. But we run into organizations that have horrible data a lot. And there's a reason why they're going out to market to buy a better software product to help them manage just the complete deluge of data that they're getting inundated with. There's a tsunami of data coming in, and you have to have a good system in place, both a system from a software standpoint, an ecosystem of systems from the standpoint of everything that integrates into that software, as well as a s the human software of your organization, the people that actually understand fleet management fundamentals. They know how to use the software. They know what goes into it so that they can get good information out of it and get business intelligence out of it. So that's a good important plug for, fleet education, which obviously everybody's in here, hopefully learning something today that they can apply in their day-to-day jobs. Other considerations for life cycle cost analysis are the assumptions that you use. What does inflation look like? Like I said, inflation is typically, you could just say vehicles are 3% more expensive per year than they were last year and run that number out over time. Um, and But there are some short run, like 2020 being specific, 2021, where you're looking at 15% year over year inflation on new vehicle pricing. Um, but if you look at a 30-year time horizon, 3% is a good planning number. Um, Obviously, you've got your forecast and then there's reality, and you have to be able to adjust it or at least articulate why your numbers come out the way they do. Um, there's a downtime penalty for retaining older vehicles. And also, you lose some degree of fuel efficiency for retaining older vehicles. One way to save on fuel in a fleet is just to buy newer vehicles. Usually the new vehicle designs are smaller engines. They're trending towards turbocharging, more gears in the transmission to keep those engine RPMs low. And that translates into better fuel economy for modern vehicles, even if you don't go with an alternative fuel type. And then this is more kind of math nerd stuff you can probably ignore, but a sensitivity analysis of key assumptions. And I could easily say, well, what would it look like if in this whole analysis we just said fuel is $5 a gallon instead of $4 a gallon? How much does that actually move the needle on? Does it actually change your replacement cycle criteria to say now it's more advantageous? If fuel is $8 a gallon, is it more advantageous to replace vehicles every 7 years so you get those older, more fuel consuming vehicles out of the fleet? So there's some trade-off here. What I will say is that I've done life cycle cost analysis. I actually did a project working for the State Department doing this, which that is a complicated fleet because you're talking about vehicles operating in 180 countries around the world, different currencies, different units of measure. You're looking at how much does it cost per liter for an imperial gallon of petrol? Like, you got to figure out what that looks like. Okay. So doing life cycle cost analysis there, what I found was that the biggest thing that drives a change in the replacement parameter is utilization. It's always going to be vehicle miles traveled, hands down. So the more miles that a vehicle travels, the faster you've got to replace it. It's pretty basic assumption, but it was kind of cool to look at it from a math standpoint. Now we're back to the point-based system for replacement planning that you had mentioned earlier. One of the things that we applied in the Forest Service was a point-based parameter system for replacement prioritization. And this is not a new thing. Some organizations, I introduced this concept when I was at the Forest Service, and people thought this was like I had dreamed this up from somewhere. It's like, no, this has been part of some of the fleet management software packages for 20 years, to use a point-based system that looks at not only your mileage or age of the vehicle, but it applies an adjustment to those vehicles based on how many miles have you driven the vehicle versus the planned optimal mileage that you found during the life cycle cost analysis? How many months has that vehicle been in service relative to your age criteria? And then another factor is how much maintenance or repair have you spent on that vehicle relative to its replacement cost? I mean, you would never think of spending $40,000 to replace an engine in a Prius. That would not be economical to do, but you would do it for a $675,000 transit bus. So that last factor can kind of scale how much you're willing to spend on maintenance or repair relative to the overall asset value for its replacement. So that's something that I found useful running a fleet of 18,000 vehicles, because we had some regions or forests that were replacing vehicles way too quickly and they're wasting money. And we had some that weren't replacing them quickly enough. And it was more of a function of the attitudes and personalities of, the people, the local fleet manager and their leadership about what they were wanting to spend money on but looking at it from a 30,000 foot view, I wanted for everybody to be using a consistent, evidence-based, mathematical approach to saying, these are the priorities, these aren't. And in doing so, we were able to identify assets that we could defer and not replace, and those were capital costs we could avoid. If you can do that in your fleet, then there's another area where you haven't even changed your fleet size, but you've freed up more capital to roll back into your electric vehicle implementation if you're going in that direction. One of the other aspects of this, like I said, the utilization is what drives the biggest change in the appropriate replacement criteria or replacement age. Using a point-based system like this helps out a lot when you have a lot of vehicles of a similar type in one class, and you assume like, I'm going to replace all of these in the same age criteria. Having a point-based system like this allows vehicles within the same class to be spread out to a more appropriate replacement timing than replacing, say, all of them at 8 years or all of them at a certain mileage. Sorry, I want to keep an eye on time. Next area is actually translating that into a replacement plan. So one of the things to look at is, what is your benchmark plan, which is how many vehicles do you have in your fleet that are currently due for replacement? And then how many will you have in each subsequent year after that, assuming that you replaced everything that's in need of replacement today? Then you have, what is the status quo? What are you actually able to accomplish within the normal spending level for your organization? What would a modified plan look like to get you from this huge backlog that you probably have to the right level of spending over time, so that you're not trying to buy out the backlog all at once? And then that would be like an optimized plan for your fleet. The next level would be, okay, let's look at that optimized plan and start to substitute in vehicles that are electrified or plug-in hybrid and see how that changes the total spend. Obviously, nobody's going to get a giant bucket of money that says I can replace all my vehicles in my fleet today with electric vehicles. So it's, by necessity, it's going to be something that happens over time. And usually it would be when vehicles are currently worn out and due for replacement. EVs, the costs are coming down. A big component of the electric vehicle cost is how much it costs for the OEM to provide a kilowatt hour of battery capacity, right? So because the battery is such a huge percentage of the cost of the overall vehicle, that number is really what drives a lot of the cost. And those numbers have been coming down. I haven't looked at them too recently, but they started off in the $250 per kilowatt hour, and then they've I think 2025 is the year that some of the industry experts were forecasting they get down to $150 an hour. But nobody's ever really 100% clear on what that amount is, because that's a lot of proprietary information internal to the companies. So it's kind of a best guess from the industry as to what that number is. But when you reach that 150 threshold, that's when electric vehicles can become more cost efficient over their life than their than equally capable internal combustion vehicles. And then additionally, more and more options are becoming available over time as manufacturers develop new platforms and retire old platforms. They start to get more and more vehicle types that are actually PHEV or EV. A lot of the data that's used to develop a replacement plan, you'd be looking at your fleet inventory, what classes. We talked about vehicle classification as an important component, how old they are. Obviously, you want to know how many miles or hours there are on the assets. And you could look at that in terms of annualized if you have both current miles and hours and age. Fuel consumption. And then within each class, you have you would want to know what's the average age. What would be, I'm sorry, that I shouldn't say average age. What's the age at which you should be replacing vehicles of that class? What's the mileage? What's the purchase price for new vehicles of that type? Inflation, and what EV alternatives are out there that you could take advantage of. So we talked about having this benchmark plan. That's one of the first steps in order to understand and build that modified plan, and then move on to having that EV transition plan. So this is actually an example of a benchmark replacement plan. So you have a huge spike of vehicles that are due for replacement in 2025 as this giant red bar here. And then after that, you have different replacement spending requirements of different levels. And so this is not really, this is a statement of how the fleet is right now, but it's definitely not a statement of what your budget shop is going to buy off on in terms of replacing vehicles. Budgeting folks like steady numbers. They want to go, well, what was it last year? Add 3%, or what was it last year? Drop it 5%. So having a replacement plan that looks at $40 million in the first year and then drops down to, I can't even read that on the screen, $5 million in the second year, that's too much volatility in the plan for any organization to really get in line with. So that's why it becomes necessary to build a more smooth or steady plan or modified replacement plan over time. One of the things that you'll notice in this plan is that there are actually 3 spikes. And that's what happens when you replace a huge chunk of the fleet in 1 year. This is now all the vehicles that were replaced in 2025. Most of the vehicles in this fleet are on an 8-year cycle. So when it hits 2023, you've got this giant spike again. And then 2041, there's going to be another spike. You don't want those spikes in your fleet replacement plan. You want all of these to look relatively flat. I'm going to jump past this chart in the interest of time. Here's actually what this fleet was doing. They were at $3.8 million per year, and that was about all they were getting. So the obvious thing is that the gap and that backlog of replacement are just going to continue to grow over time unless they do a course correction and either reduce their fleet size or bring up their capital replacement expenditure to be in alignment with how fast they're wearing vehicles out. When we get to a modified replacement plan for this fleet, we bump up their spending to like $9.5 million per year. And what actually starts to happen is in the red, we have overdue vehicles. So really for the first 3 years and change, all that's getting replaced are vehicles that are well past their replacement criteria. You're not even getting to vehicles that are coming due for replacement in that current year. And then you're getting to vehicles that you might have intentionally postponed. And then it's really after, several years, 8 years, that you're actually getting to replacing vehicles on time, quote unquote, that every vehicle in the fleet, that there's money to replace it when it hits its replacement criteria. So these are the kind of things that you would have to understand as a fleet manager in order to then layer on top what an EV transition plan should look like. So you can see a comparison here of the orange being the benchmark plan and the blue being the modified plan. So the modified plan is obviously starts at a certain level, and then we're just ratcheting up by 3% per year over time to come up with that smooth, steady replacement. Now here we are. Let's see. The modified plan, we were at 9.5 million in spending. To go to an EV replacement plan, you've actually got to bump up to 11.2. So there's a couple $1,000,000 there that is going to be an increase in spending for the organization to make that transition to electric vehicles, because at least for this particular fleet, their fleet mix dictated these numbers. So every organization needs to be able to articulate all of these life cycle cost factors, their fleet replacement planning considerations, so that when they go to ask for money, additional money for the fleet, not only are they trying to ask for money to catch up on fleet replacement, but generally trying to add money on top of that to pay for the EVs, that they have the data to support that type of transition. And other considerations to think about would be grant and incentive opportunities, federal EV tax credits, and battery replacement versus buying new EVs. So I'm not sure how many people have gotten into battery replacement on electric vehicles. I think when I was at Montgomery County, Maryland, we had a hybrid bus fleet, not even fully electric, and it was at the time like $35,000 to put a battery refresh in a transit bus. It was worth it for a $700,000 bus, but
for some old Priuses, or was it?
Yeah.
4 or 5 grand or so for a car that sold for $4 grand or ours.
Right. So I think we wanted to end at what time?
We got 10 minutes.
Okay. So we got 10 minutes of Q&A. So what do we got? Stump the chump. Anything. Fleet related. Go ahead.
Is there a use case for advantage of having some sort of offer as you're bringing on temporary crews or leasing crews to put a lease program or rental into the calculations, or is this strictly for just ownership of fleet?
It's the question.
I'm not sure I tracked all of the question. Is there a use case for bringing in additional capacity from a rental standpoint or a leasing standpoint?
Does it make sense to lease or rent sometimes a portion of your line?
Yes, it does. And there's folks from Enterprise here in the room. So the Forest Service is a huge Enterprise customer. So definitely there are cases where it makes more financial sense for a vehicle to be rented for a short-term time period than to actually own it or bring it into the fleet. I can provide you with a specific example. So coming from the Forest Service, we had a big wildfire fighting program. I mean, right? It's all over the news, especially in California, especially this time of year. And even other times of year. Obviously, we had the incident down in the Los Angeles area in January. So we're getting extended fire seasons, but that relies on a huge deployment of resources. And this is kind of an unorthodox case, but every summer we deploy a huge number of resources from all over the country, not only from the Forest Service, but interagency response, coming from people that are red carded, which means qualified incident responders that have to show up at a fire camp, have transportation, and be able to either take their vehicle from their home unit and go to the fire, or show up there and have a vehicle available for them. So what we utilized heavily was actually a program through Enterprise Truck Rentals for renting vehicles, because they were being rented for a short duration. Hopefully we could show up, get the fire managed, and get it hopefully contained and put a box around it, and then start demobilizing resources. But that required that we had a pool of available rental vehicles that were of sufficient type. And in our case, it was generally 3/4 ton trucks with high ground clearance and off-road tires, so that they could show up at the fire, we could use them, and then pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I'm done with these, take them back." And so we had a big contract in place to do that. There are other use cases for it. In just what's your fleet organization type?
So we're a truck upfitter.
Truck upfitter. Okay.
So we deal with a bunch of different types of entities from municipalities to find that breed small, medium, large. And so just to find the type of mix to it by the customer, they're like 10%, 20% kind of surge we then
Right.
temporary or for what would be the best, most advantageous way to manage their fleet.
Yeah, and it depends. It's going to be situational. Obviously, if there's an ongoing demand for that asset over a long time period, then yeah, you would probably want to own it. That'd be the less expensive ownership type. Then you might go to commercial leasing as another option. That's going to be a little bit more expensive, but you might have some wraparound services involved in that make it advantageous. Like with Enterprise, they would deliver the truck to where we needed it, and they would pick it up when we didn't need it. That was part of it. Another consideration would be geography. I mean, I've worked on a project with a pipeline construction company, or a solar grid installation company, where 60% of the assets that they used at any given time were Sunbelt Rentals or United Rentals or Herc Rentals or Enterprise or any of the other big rental outfits, because they needed to mobilize resources in a specific area, have people travel in, do the work, and then demobilize, and everybody goes home. So it's there's a high volatility for the demand for the assets. That's when you're going to see, I guess, to simply put it, the volatility and demand for the asset is going to make it more advantageous to go to a rental market or something like that. I mean, employee travel is a prime example of that. Like, I rented a car to come here. I needed a car in California. My company's in Arizona. I live in Maryland. So it doesn't make any sense. That's obvious. Right. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I believe right sizing your fleet is probably the most critical because you should all be doing all the time. What do you do with your support to make any of those decisions? Actually, right? So I'm assuming the project that you worked on, 18 by or 17,000 at the Fed level, did that change with the political leadership?
The question was, what do you do when you don't have the political will or leadership support for fleet right sizing, and what usually drives that support? So part of it could be a simple matter of making the costs of the fleet evident to the decision makers. So a lot of times fleet is treated like a sunk cost. We've paid for the vehicles, therefore we can keep them forever and and use them. And it's part an education exercise. It's part an analytical exercise that if you can articulate, like, okay, here are all these vehicles, and part of it is a data collection effort. Part of it's hidden, right? We had to go put technology into vehicles to find the ones that weren't being used. We had to survey people to get them to either come right out and say that they didn't need the vehicles, or build data from their response that indicated that they didn't need the vehicles. And then we had to have some sort of approach to say, in a fair and equitable way, we've run the math, and here's what we recommend can be gotten rid of, and here would be the financial benefits of doing so. So there's no easy, like, simple answer. It could simply be a change in leadership. I mean, I worked for the federal government. We saw a big change in leadership this year, and it had a variety of impacts across the board. And I think fleet's going to be one of the downstream effects of that if you start, getting rid of a big chunk of the workforce. If there's a huge downsizing or cost-cutting effort, one of the areas, it's like, you could propose it as this way. if part of the organization needs to make cuts to their budget, the simple question is, do you care more about your people or your vehicles? Because those are some of the trade-off decisions that you could run into if your budget is cut. Are we going to go into layoffs while we still have all these expensive vehicles sitting in the back lot that we could get rid of and sell and maybe save some people's jobs or continue to deliver services at a high level? So it's going to be situational depending upon the attitudes of the leadership that you're trying to brief. But, gathering data, analyzing, educating, and then presenting the trade-offs, I think would be the 4 areas I would focus on. Anybody else? We're good?
Maybe that was awesome.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Well, I turn see the ears now. So we're going to move on to case studies for 2 municipal fleets in Sacramento and Oakland. And Richard will be here in just a moment. So, Ron, you want to go ahead and
We'll get you up and running again. All right. And thank you, Stop.
All right. Thank you.
Appreciate it. That's a great job.
Well, how much time? Thank you to RTA you're logging in. I highly recommended you on
To take a look at the RTA website because there's a whole lot of tools on there and best practices that know about team operations. Or do you have to hire a consultant? But there you also get a consultant.
Yeah, and one other resource I want to highlight, absolutely free. We have a Fleet Success podcast. So like and subscribe. And look it up on YouTube. We put out content every week. Totally free. You can go on there and there's like 180 episodes and they cover all wide variety of topics centered on fleet education. So, okay.
They're the